This episode, I'm joined once again by Paul Bishop to discuss his recently released book, Jung and the Epic of Transformation, Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival and the Grail as Transformation. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running as it runs off patronage alone, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Paul Bishop, thanks once again for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to come on. I always enjoy it.
We are going to be discussing your recently released book, Jung and the Epic of Transformation, Volume 1, Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival and the Grail as Transformation, which is the first volume of a series of 4, which are going to be tackling Carl Jung's relationship analysis and the Jungian analysis of, beginning with Parzival in the Arthurian tradition, then Goethe with Faust, and both parts of Faust for the two, and then the fourth volume is Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So the sort of literary cornerstones of Jung's own life and Jungian thought as these texts, which are sort of quite easy in a way to utilize as Jungian touchstones of depth and analysis. But what is the genesis of I guess, this first volume and the series? Where did this spring from?
Yeah, thanks for that. In a way, it goes back to 2019. I was invited by Leslie Gardner to contribute to a book that she was editing called Narratives of Individuation. And it's got me thinking about the role of narrative and individuation as narrative, and can we find, for a model of individuation, narratives of a kind of canonical nature of the sort that I've identified in this series. And then the following year, in March 2020, I was at a conference in Stuttgart, which I'd been very kindly invited to, with analysts. And I mentioned in one paper Goethe's Faust. And someone came up to me at the end and said, well, I'm really interested in what you were saying there about Faust. And I said, well, you know the story. And they said, well, actually, no, I don't. And then, of course, this was just before the pandemic began. And then when COVID hit, one of the things I thought that I would try and do to keep myself sane through those incredibly crazy times was to take the advice that's given by Angelus Silesius when he says, Mensch werde wesentlich. So become essential. Think about the things that are really essential. And this pushed me back to thinking about what are the really core texts if you're interested in Jung. And it seems to me that it's to do with the Grail, and it's to do with Faust, and it's to do with Nietzsche. And therefore, can we see these books as part of what I'm calling an epic of transformation that leads up ultimately to Jung's own epic, which is the Red Book. And that was how it came about.
There's something interesting there, actually, from that person who commented to you at the end of that conference and said, well, actually, no, I don't know the tale of, in that case, Faust. But there's something, in relation to Parzival and the seemingly intertwined and very, very complex history of the Arthurian tradition and the textual Arthurian tradition. There's something there that unfortunately I would have to sort of mirror that statement, because in a way it's our heritage as being from Britain. That's sort of our myths, if we were to go with Jung's Jungian notion perhaps of a national myth which we're connected to in some unconscious way. And yet you don't hear much about the Arthurian tradition anymore.
Well, I think you put your finger on something very important there, which is that we've been having debates in the academy now for a couple of decades about the canon, and is there such a thing as a canon? And of course, you've had weighing in on the pro canon side that great book by Harold Bloom on the Western canon, and yet canonicity is kind of slipping away in practice, whether we believe in a canon or not. simply through a failure to give attention to these texts. And in some ways, I think that the Academy doesn't help this matter by seeing itself as kind of the guardian of the canon these days, the guardian of the anti-canon. And we put up lots of barriers around these texts, and we emphasize how difficult they are, and we emphasize all the problems of the state of the manuscripts and the text, and we invent all kinds of pseudo questions which make it hard for us to actually see these works for the important ones that they are. And so I think one of the things that I find very useful about Jung is that he's a great way to recover these texts. He's a great way to recovering them as important, not simply as something which is part of being well brought up and a kind of good bourgeois reader, but of something which has a real existential authenticity to them. And what I hope that I can do in this series is to invite people to think about this epic of transformation, and actually then to encourage them to go back and look at the texts, which are now in one form or another freely available.
Mm. Now, you said texts plural there, not just Parzival, because this history, as per your very, very lengthy, almost 80-page introduction, with not only a sort of a complete history of, the Arthurian texts and the texts surrounding the Grail, but also the post-Grail texts leading all the way through to someone such as you mentioned. I'll mention him because you referenced that I gave you the reference, but someone in the 70s, such as Gareth Knight, who was using the Grail. So this is of an extremely thorough history. But even when we look back at the early days of this saga, these cycles, it's not exactly clear if there's an origin or, plagiarism, who's taking from who, something's being rewritten, something's being reappropriated. There's not really, even though it is a linear history, it doesn't really seem linear. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense to me. And I think what I tried to do in the introduction, and it does take a bit of time and space to do it, but I think it's important for the context to establish the context for what follows in the series, is to think about the tradition of the epic, and that this has long been something that's been talked about. I've referenced a particular debate between Goethe and Schiller on the question of what makes an epic and an epic. And then in particular on the epic, which is based around the figure of King Arthur, the Arthurian tradition, the Grail legend, and so on. And I think that's one of the things that's fascinating about this, about that particular epic line, is that it's not simply a British myth that you talked about. In some ways, it is anything to do with King Arthur. That is very, very British in some way, but it is also Celtic, and it's also Breton. So it's a very, very curious thing. And I think the more that one looks at the history of the Grail, it's a bit like the Grail itself. The more tantalizing it gets, the more you think, oh, I'm actually tracing this down to where this damn thing came from. But it's always elusive in some way. And in that sense, the various iterations of the Grail legend are like a kind of exercice spirituel in themselves. You keep seeing different accounts. Sometimes it's Parsifal, who's important. Sometimes it's Gawain. Sometimes it's Lancelot. So it's a very, very complex thing. And Wolfram's account is perhaps the most complex of all. So what's not to like about it?
Mm. One thing, just before we get to Jung, actually, I'm trying to think of other myths or other sort of sagas that in the modern world we're still fairly familiar, I think, with Prometheus and Greek myths. We're still relatively familiar with the grammar of the Bible. But it just seems to me that the Arthurian just has fallen off. Do you think this is to do with the style, to do with the era? If you agree with me, that is there a reason that this one just in common, we know the figures, but you don't see culture engage with it directly as much.
Yeah. No, I think you're right that there is a kind of archetypal continuity there. I mean, a good example, I suppose, of a cross-cultural legend or myth might be that of the Great Flood. So you have it in the Hebrew Bible, you have it in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The story of the flood is, as it were, the great first disaster movie of its time, really, isn't it? Where everything's going to be swept away. So I think you're right that there are these specific examples, archetypes that one could see as participating in various epic traditions. And I also think you're right about the Arthurian one, because it is particularly mysterious, and perhaps because of that reason, that's why it's been picked up so many times by a diverse range of writers, including right into our century as well. And I gave the example simply because I think it was one of the most popular one in recent times of the notorious book Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which became the feeder, if you like, for the Dan Brown novel and subsequently the film. But again, there's so much about the Grail which is meant to be foundational, and there you have a wonderful, I think we could call it, a postmodern instantiation of the Grail legend for our time.
Mm-hmm. And moving to Jung, biographically to begin with, Jung, this is one of Jung's first, as a young lad, literary sort of obsessions. He has this book on the bookshelf at around age 10, I believe, and becomes obsessed, which in a way is a sort of a testament to the difference in culture. I think a lot of young people now would probably struggle, especially with the not turgid but older style of Parzival. So what is it about Parzival that Jung gels with?
Yeah. But of course, I wonder if today people, instead of reading the Grail legends, maybe they'll be sort of having war game versions of it or something like that. I think in the case of Jung, it fits in very early, I think, to his sense of belonging to another era. And of course, that's one of the fascinating things about the Grail, is this sense of, what is it going to tell us in the present about the past? And I think that Jung is fascinated by the way that the story of the Grail takes us back to the Middle Ages. And of course, there is this famous remark that Jung makes in his Red Book when he says, we've really got to come to terms with the Middle Ages. I've done so with not just the Middle Ages in me, but the Middle Ages in other people as well. So I think this establishes very early on this sense, we could call it a kind of instinct for historicity on Jung's part, an interest in the past, obsession, if you like, with the past, but not as something which is merely academic in the sense of in the negative sense of that word, of irrelevant, but as something which is vitally important to him. In fact, he says, or words are attributed to him in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, that he says when he talks about reading the stories of the Grail at the age of 15, he says, I had an inkling that a great secret still lay hidden behind those stories. So there's something which is pulling him into this account. He says it would therefore be quite natural to me that the dream, he's talking about one of the Grail dreams that we might want to talk about, he says, the quest of the Knights of the Grail, he says, was for, in the deepest sense, my own world. A world, he says, which had scarcely anything to do with folly. So it is very much something which turns out to be at the existential core of Jung himself as a thinker and as a person.
There's something very intriguing there that you mentioned about the Middle Ages. And in a recent discussion, actually, with Peter Harrison, we discussed this academic leap that often happens where you study the pre-Socratics, then you study the Greeks, and then you maybe touch of the Romans, and then you go, right, now it's time to take the leap. And you leap all the way to Descartes, and then you continue your journey because we're very comfortable. And those two sides seem to have the same sort of myths and narratives that are very comfortable together, and we're very comfortable with Westerners. But you're missing out about 1,200 years of history. This is quite literally the Middle Ages, the medieval era. And this makes me think of the etymology of Parzival, as you point out, to pierce through, which is a fairly good two-word summary of Jung's own psychoanalysis. What is it about the Middle Ages? What is it about this seemingly dire period of trudging through something that Jung finds so fascinating? Why do we have to deal with that?
No, I think you're right. That there is a kind of prejudice against the Middle Ages, as if they are simply centuries of darkness, and we are, with our fixation on modernity and post-modernity, not so interested, it might seem, in this epoch. Partly, I think, because the sheer size of what's attempted in that, one thinks about the physical, the architectural cathedrals of the Middle Ages, but also the intellectual edifices like Thomas Aquinas, and the sheer scale of that can, I think, appear intimidating to we moderns or we postmoderns in that way. And I think it's therefore significant that Jung, in the Red Book and elsewhere, identifies this period as something that we have to engage with, something he actually says we have to catch up with the Middle Ages within ourselves. And I wonder if part of the reluctance that we have to look at the Middle Ages is because the Middle Ages does reveal so much to us about us.
Okay, we might come back to that. Before we go into Jung's understanding of the text, I was rereading the story of Parzival in bits and pieces this morning, of course, and then realised that this is a question that's kind of tough. If possible, a brief encapsulation of the story of Parzival, if that's not too much to ask, before we head out on our own journey here.
It's not too much to ask, but it's a big ask because
it's condensing. That's the problem.
It's an incredibly complex work, but I think it's one of the fascinating things about it. And in some respect, just as in the case of Star Wars, you have your prequels and prequels to prequels. You've got something of the same which is going on in the narrative structure of Wolfram's Parsifal, which I think stands out from all the other treatments of the Grail legend for this remarkable complexity. So the book, the work opens with a kind of the backstory, which is that of his father, Gamoret, going off to the east. And there's an awful lot of post-colonial discussion that we have about this text. Just grant this fact that it goes off to the east. He, with the Bellicane, gives birth to a child, Firefeet, child that is described as being black and white, like a magpie. Back Gamoret comes to Europe, and he marries another woman, Herzleid, the suffering of the heart, and she has a child, and so this is Parsifal. So Firefeet disappears from the picture, but it'll come back at the end. And we have Parsifal in the forest, significant in the forest, not the world of the court, being brought up as a kind of only child by Herzleid. She wants to keep him away from the court, but one day he sees knights riding through the forest, and he's absolutely riveted by the view. He thinks one of them is God. And one of the questions that he asks very early on is the same question that Aquinas asks, was meant to have asked when he was a young man. Was ist Gott? What is God? Now, why would he think that one of the knights is God? Has to do with the fact that Herzleid has given him a kind of theology lesson, which says that in God all is light. And he sees the reflective metal of the knight's armor. He thinks, well, look, this is all light. It therefore must be God. The one thing Herzleid doesn't want him to do is to go off to that nasty world of the court. But off Parsifal wants to go, and so in order to spike his plans, she dresses him up as a fool, as a clown, as someone who is tum, to stop him getting in with the world of the court. When he arrives at the court, this problem of his clothes is solved when he fights a battle with the Red Knight, kills him, and takes over his armor. And so we have this very interesting imagery of the external world of the court in the form of the armor being put over this tumpheit, this folly, which is, of course, great wisdom in disguise. And off he sets on a series of adventures. First of all, to meet the old knight Gornemont, who gives him this piece of advice that leads him so very much astray: you shouldn't be swift to question. And this means Parzival's got this at the back of his mind when he comes across Amfortas, the Fisher King, and is advised to spend the night in the castle of Mont Salvêche, the mountain of salvation. And that's where he sees the ritual of the Grail. And of course, thinking of Gornemont, he does not ask the question. And one of the things that the question, we'll return to this, has various formulations, but it's linked up, the whole Grail ceremony is linked up with the fact that the Fisher King, Amfortas, is suffering from a terrible wound. So the next morning, everybody's disappeared, and we're now halfway through, and that's really the point where the actual quest for the Grail begins. But it's going to be a quest for Parsifal's own identity as well, because it's going to turn out that he is, in fact, though he doesn't know it, the Grail King. Two, I think, important episodes stand out. A moment when he has a kind of visionary trance experience, when he sees blood on the snow and simply we can't see anything of the environment around him, and we're not quite sure what's happening to him. It's a very strange moment. Lots of discussion about what does this blood on the snow mean. There's kind of erotic symbolism to it, the red on the white. It's thematizing the importance of blood and blood relations is an important part of the Parsifal epic. But of course, it also recalls the redeeming blood of Christ. And this leads us back to the function of the Grail itself. Second key moment is when he, on Good Friday, encounters the hermit Trevisan, who tells him the story of the Grail and how the dove descends upon it on Good Friday. Gives a kind of strange neo-Gnostic account of the battle between Lucifer and the Divine Trinity, and the role of the neutral angels as in-between figures who have brought the Grail down to Earth. In the final part of the epic, Parzival fights a knight who turns out to be none other than his half-brother, Hierophants. Parzival goes to the Grail question, to the Grail castle, and this time, when he does see Amfortas suffering, he answers the question, and this releases Amfortas from his suffering. Hierophants falls in love with the person who carries the Grail, the bearer of the Grail, Réponse de Joie, a repository of joy, and Parzival's wife, Conduire Amour, who will conduct us to love, Conduire Amour, joins Parzival with their two sons, Cardites and Lohengrin, and Lohengrin, of course, goes off to be another epic on its own. That's it in a nutshell, if a rather clumsy nutshell. I told you it was complex. It is.
Did you happen to read Parzival prior to your interest in Jung? Or is this something that came entirely from Jung?
Yes, I did read it prior to Jung because I was very interested in medieval literature. So my first, as a student, so my first approach to it would have been through the works of Chrétien de Troyes. I think I was probably still reading Jung at the time, but it was a kind of convergence for these two things to come together. And it's really only on reflection, when working on this book, that it seems to me the whole point about the Grail and what it is linked with this idea of transformation, and that ultimately is for me what Jung is about.
Mm. So there's a sort of something now, I guess we would consider inherently Jung, well, not specifically Jungian, but key to Jungian, which is the beginning is before the beginning, in the way. The beginning of one's individuation, in a sense, is before that actual empirical beginning. And so there's these odd couple of phrases, and this is from the edition that I have from Oxford, but the unborn and of things yet to be, and he whom I have chosen for this purpose is, story-wise, yet unborn. And as you mentioned, the story really the hero's journey proper begins halfway, but the beginning is the roots of this he whom I have chosen. And what is the importance of, do you think, I guess for the tale and for Jung, of this notion of that one's individuation is never severed in that sense? It's completely intertwined with a world that's, already whirring away and full of things that have, long since been growing and dying, and etc.
I think that's right. That there is an important an interconnectedness between the outside world and the inside world, and that really is what defines Jung, is this sense of the reciprocity between something which is external to us and something which is internal to us. And there's this great line in the a prologue to Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where Jung is meant to say, in the end, the only events in my life worth telling are those when the imperishable world erupted into this transitory. And I think that there is that sense in most of the medieval Grail legend versions, and particularly in Wolfram's version, of how something which is timeless is working itself out in the world of space and time, which is also therefore the social world. And Wolfram's very interested in this question of how does the individual find a place for themselves in society. And that's why I say that one of the things that the Parsifal is questing for is for his identity, because he's trying to find his place in the world, and it turns out that it's a very important one because he is the Grail King. But he has to work at it to get there. And what we're really seeing is this transition, this transformation, if you will, from a completely asocialized child brought up in the forest, whose mother dresses him as a fool so that he doesn't get involved with society, to someone who then acquires a leading representative kind of function in society, and who is therefore, by being associated with the Grail, responsible for the redemption of that society. So one of the themes of the Grail legend is this idea of the desert, of the wasteland. Of course, that's where we know that probably most likely in terms of T.S. Eliot at the moment. But the question of salvation is not just something which is on an individual level. It's very much on a social, on a collective level as well. And I think that's one of the things that marks out Jung's political thought, is that sense of how does the individual relate to the collective and vice versa.
To throw a slight curveball, and probably maybe to point out a key difference between, well, two of the figures that you're dealing with in this in these volumes. So to combine volume 1 and 4 here, so Parzival, Jung, and then Nietzsche, I see here possibly, well, I guess one could project it onto the text, which is an allusion to Nietzsche's tightrope. So Parzival beginning there in the forest as the place of primitive nature, the animal, through to the court with all its lovely bureaucratic stuff as a fool, the man, and then through to the Grail King, to the Superman. But that ending is the key difference, because for Nietzsche, well, we need the Übermensch, we need something else to come in, and the problem of salvation is far different. But for Jung, this is individuation.
I think in this game there are no curved balls, because there's subtle things which are up there at one time to mix the metaphor. But I think you're right to point to the fact that in that very early episode in the prologue in Zarathustra, we have a very medieval scenario. We have the hermit in the forest, and that is very Grail-like, Parsifal-like, Arthurian legend-like. And of course, Zarathustra plays along with it. And it's only when he takes his leave from Middle Ages, as it were, when he takes his leave from the hermit in the forest, and he says, "My goodness, hasn't the hermit heard that God is dead?" And so I think you're right that and this whole question of, we've got alive or he's dead, that's there in the Red Book, that's there in the 7 sermons to the dead. In the first of them, when Basilides proclaims that God is not dead, he's more alive than ever. So I don't think it's at all a curveball. You've got Parzival asking, "Was ist Gott?" What is God? You've got Nietzsche saying God is dead, and you've got Jung saying through the voice of possibilities, no, he isn't. He's more alive than ever. So I think all those balls do tend to be converging on the sense of there's one direction this argument is going in.
What's that direction? The question
I
of
think
God.
I think it's in the question of God, not just as an abstract theological question or an abstract metaphysical question, but as one which is vitally important for the individual. Or to translate that into Jung, I mean the Grail epic centers around this question. In fact, the unanswered, not just the unanswered, but the unposed question. In the case of Chrétien de Troyes, in his version, it is whom does the Grail serve? In Wolfram von Eschenbach's version, then the question is, what can I do to help you? What ails thee? Is the question that he should ask Amfortas. But Jung has this question he invites his readers to think about in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Are you related to something that is infinite? I think that all of these texts are asking that question in various ways. Are you related to something that is infinite?
We have to put ourselves aside, though, to do that well. And if we split out individual as to draw, even though I was quite critical of that book, I have since used the Luciferian angle from Peter Kingsley's Catafalque, his point around the individual and not individuation, the individual as being this Luciferian, self-centered, I am free to choose what cereal I buy for breakfast, I am free to, individual choices, this kind of thing. To move towards the individuation, this is really where this other question, so the two key questions that you point out in the book, one is what is God, and then moving to the other one is to move through to individuation. Why is Anfortas suffering? Is really this moment of, to become who you are, you have to not be who you are for a little while, and to have a sort of, as you said, a relationship to the internet. That is a postmodern Freudian slip right there.
That one is.
A relationship to the infinite. Yeah. So individuation, something, this question with Anfortas it's haunting, right? It's not really answered. So I will ask you to explain more so the context of this and how once you figure out what the question is, I think this has a relationship of what it is to individuate.
Yeah. No, lots to talk about there. First of all, just to pick up the point, I think Peter Kingsley is one of the most recent Jung scholars to insist on the importance of the Grail legend for Jung, and I think that's a core part of his argument about the prophetic status of Jung in Catafalque. And Kingsley is certainly interested in the Grail dreams and one Grail dream in particular. That's related in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And I think you're right about the point about individuation is there has to be something which gets you involved with that quest, which sets you off that quest on the first place. And I think, that question of lack or that question of suffering is combined with this whole episode of the failure to ask Amfortas, what ails thee? And so we have the idea of lack, we have the idea of suffering combined in this episode. And when we see Amfortas a second time, his suffering is very, very much driven home in the text. It's an appalling scene when he goes back the second time. Amfortas has his wound, his Amfortas wound. He has been to amalgamate the different versions of the story, wounded in the thigh. He's been emasculated. He has, there is something clearly linked with sexuality, and he's suffering. And his suffering is driven home by the detail of the appalling stench that the wound causes so much so that the people in the court have to open the window to try and ventilate and aerate it so much away. So it's a very visceral, literal, physical, as well as sexual and symbolic suffering that Amfortas is afflicted with. And one of the things that I think one can see is a problem with Parsifal's failure to ask the question is because it's a very obvious question to ask. And if we see somebody who's ill or somebody who falls over or somebody who doesn't look well, our immediate question would be, is everything okay with you? And of course, Parzival lacks that because of his acculturation, or his lack of it in the world of human society, and in particular the world of the court, which is by no means an unproblematic world, it should be said. But there is a kind of striking lack of empathy in the early days of Parzival, when he doesn't ask what I think for many of us would be the most basic question: is what on earth is wrong? And he doesn't even do that. So he has to go on a journey in order for the transformation to take place. And I think that's where one can see Jung's interest in the story of Parsifal, and his interest in the idea of the Grail Knights and the legend of the search of the Grail fits in very well with this idea of individuation as looking for something, and we don't know what it is that we're trying to find. Because if we knew already, we'd have it. It's an adventure into the unknown.
What do you think it is that does ail Amfortas?
Within the story, it is related to his overuse of sexuality. Of course, thinking about Jung's comment where he says, "Look, the world that I am interested in is nothing to do with Freud," is that ultimately this transcends Amfortas's sexuality. Or lack of it. It transcends his impotence, because it's not just his impotence; it's the impotence of society as a whole. It's the wasteland in which all are condemned to live, because suffering is allowed to go unhealed. So I think that suffering is both to do with an incorrect or misapplied sexuality. And of course, common to both Freud and Jung is this sense of organizing one's libidinal drives is part of what it means to be a healed human being, but it too is as well.
So, to delve into another aspect of that, why do you think it is that Parzival just is so ignorant that he doesn't ask the question? Do we think ourselves too much of ourselves to think that we would definitely ask such a question? Is it a far bigger question than we realize? Are we not really asking it? There is much more at stake there.
Yeah. Again, thinking back to the circumstances prior to him seeing Amfortas in the Grail Castle and the ritual and not understanding it, is this question of the advice that he's been given by Gornemans: don't be swift to question. And I think one can find a parallel here with the debate over the exact text, if you like, the legal text of the wager that Faust makes with Mephistopheles. And big question when in Faust, the second part of Faust, right at the end, when Faust says, "Oh, I wish I could." I might say to the moment, hang on, don't disappear, don't be fleeting, tarry a while, I want to keep on with you. That's really very close to what he's committed to with Mephistopheles in part one, but it's not exactly the same thing. And I think with the case of the advice given by Gornemans, that in some senses is good advice. It's not a social thing to go around interrogating other people, but there are other occasions where you should ask it. So I think Parsifal demonstrates that learning is a twofold process. It's both about getting information about what you should do, but it's also then about information to say that you've understood properly the advice that you've been given. And so Parsifal has to have not just Gurnemanz as his first tutor, but he has to have a second one, Trevritsen, who takes him, as it were, up to the A levels of empathy and theological understanding, and helps Parsifal put right what he'd done wrong the first time by his over reliance on, or his misunderstanding of, what Gurnemanz tells him.
So before, tiptoeing around it like the book itself does, before we get to the actual Grail itself, which is, we're not going to define that today, so not fully at least. There is a sort of, I always like to bring in the modern world, as Jung did. And what you mentioned about going on a journey, in a way, going on an adventure, going on the hero's journey, stepping foot out of the door. It actually reminds me, it's sort of a very Jungian scene, actually, of the opening of The Hobbit, where you have this oh-so-comfortable Bilbo Baggins, who doesn't want to leave the most comfortable of places, which is Hobbiton, and then eventually something, I'm off on an adventure, and he has to leave the comfort, and he has to step out of his door. But the question I really have there is, do you think we're still going on, maybe not so much are we still going on adventures today, but is that impulse which says you need to go suffer? If you step over the threshold of the door and do this, I think the unconscious acknowledgement, as Jung is making clear with his reading of Parzival, is there's going to be sacrifice, there's going to be suffering. So we're going on adventures, we're going on holidays, but are we stepping over the threshold anymore? Are we making this? And I think maybe the more important question would be is the grammar, is that foundation there that's needed for you to understand what that decision is?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, and you used the word adventure, and the Middle High German version of it, Aventura, is chock full of meaning. It's a central idea in medieval epic, is that your hero is going to go on a series of Aventuren. So one thing after another, and each of the episodes will, like the task that's given to the 12 labors of Hercules, each of the Aventuren is going to test or develop a particular aspect of the character of the hero. So there's a sequentiality here, which is important, as well as the individual episodes. What's important is they form a sequence. I think that's one of the reasons, by the way, that someone whom you've discussed in your podcast a number of times, Rudolf Steiner. Steiner was very interested in the Grail as well, and has this idea that as the child matures, going through school, going through Waldorf schools, presumably. This can be seen as like going through a medieval epic and going through various stages of the individuation of the individual child. But I think what Parzival also shows is things happen, and one of the things that happens that kicks this off are those knights who happen to go through the forest. In other words, there can be if we're to believe what Wolfram's saying here, there is no such thing as a withdrawal from society. It's going to come out and get you one way or another. So you've got to know how to engage with it, and Parsifal has to learn how to deal with the world of the court, which is not entirely positive in the way that it's described. Kundry, who acts as the messenger of the Grail, at one point is very critical of the way that things have become. So even in the old days of King Arthur, things were not what they used to be. But hence all the more reason for Parzival to become the Grail King and to redeem the court as well as every other level of society as well. And that's why I think it's significant that if you look at the legends as a whole, sometimes it's Percival who's the key figure, sometimes it's Gawain, sometimes it's Lancelot. There are many different quests, many different Aventuren, many different iterations of the Grail as well that await discovery.
It's interesting what you said there, that whether you like it or not, society will come and grab you, come and get you. And it makes me realize that that's not necessarily an external question, because I think back to COVID, and all of a sudden we're not in society, but actually that was one of the times where, a mass of people all of a sudden had started having existential quandaries because they probably actually finally had to sit with their own journey or lack of.
Yeah.
And so this is something internal that is calling us. The Grail is calling us. This journey is calling us. And we've got to head in a certain direction, which I guess for Jung is individuation, which is going to be filled with suffering. But at the end, there is this thing called the Grail.
It's all predicated on this mysterious thing, which takes different forms depending on which version of the legend you go through. At the most fundamental level, I suppose, it is to root it in the biblical Catholic tradition from which it comes. It is the chalice, either the chalice that was used at the Last Supper, or more imaginatively, the chalice that was used to collect the blood of Christ as it fell from his wounds on the cross. In the case of Chrétien, it appears to be a platter. Various other versions have it as a large platter, a small platter. And in the case of Wolfram, it appears to be stone. And recent scholarship has said that it's an artifact called the Bamberg altarpiece. It's many, many different things, but common to them all is this numinosity, this transcendentality which surrounds it, that makes it this mysterious thing, which is the Grail. So even though it manifests itself in different ways, in each case, it has a function which is to be nourishing or restorative or redemptive in various ways. Some versions of it make of the Grail a kind of literal provider of food and drink. In other versions, and particularly in that beautiful image which is covered up, which is brought up by Trevritsen, of the white dove descending with the host down into the cup, which will keep Amfortas alive just for a little bit longer. That iconography, I think, points to the peculiar relationship that the Grail has to the Christian idea of redemption, but it's not quite part of that Orthodox Christian view of what redemption would be via the Church.
Mm. What is the sickness that it's healing? What is wrong with the soul that it is redeeming?
I think in the case of Parsifal, it's his exclusion from society, his misunderstanding of the nature of God. He has to be brought out of this very simplistic theology, which is given from his mother, and he has to understand his part in relation to healing the suffering of Amfortas. So his wound, if you like, it has to be his discovery for his identity, which is organized in relation to the Grail. So the Grail is, if we wanted to use postmodern parlance, a kind of master signifier. Without the Grail, none of the legend makes sense. And so it exists in as much as it's a kind of nodal point or quilting point, which brings all the other aspects of the story, all the other aspects of the legend, if we view them as a whole, together. It's the source of these incredibly complex narratives, and it's precisely because it's the center that we're unable to immediately point to it and identify it. The Grail is as many things as there are readers of its legend.
So I was just about to comment that you mentioned the master signifier idea, and the intriguing fact about that is that the more you dig at this master signifier, the more it sort of falls apart. You have to sort of leave it be. You can only sort of see it in your peripheral vision, and this, in a way, is sort of, I think, something that modern rationalist men and women need, is an ability to not not need that. There's a lack of certainty that comes with the answer that is the Grail, which even though Jung mentions that it's not Freudian, it seems sort of like a element of castration there. That sort of need to define, need to be whole, or whatever it might be. But with the Grail, there is, as you say, this past signify, this point of convergence. But you look right at it, and it's lost. And we don't like that. We like certainty. We like knowing things, but we don't. We get to know here, but not in a definitional way.
No, I think you're right, and in a way, that's the whole genius of this idea of the Grail, wherever it comes from, and there are all kinds of accounts of Celtic sources, Gnostic sources. And it's actually thematized by Wolfram himself and Parsifal by inventing this figure called Kayot. We're told in no uncertain terms by Wolfram that Chrétien de Troyes has got it all wrong, and Kayot can actually tell you where it is, the true version of the myth. And it turns out that even Kayot gets it from an astronomer called Phlegetanis. So there's a kind of nice thematization, perhaps almost a parody, in one of the most foundational versions of this legend, of this idea of tracing something back to its source. And the fascinating thing, clever because I think it still works for today, and that's why so many people are interested in it, as I try to show in that opening chapter, is that it speaks to the possibility of something that we don't yet know, and that's both fascinating and frightening at one and the same time. And I think that's what Jung gets from this sense of the Grail as well, is that it's both fascinating and frightening. One of the figures whom I didn't have time to talk about in this book, but I'll hope to bring it in when I get to volume 4, if I get that far, is of course the figure of Merlin. And again, we've got various Celtic legends, different sorts of sources that feed into this figure of Merlin the magician. But just to put down a marker that he's an important figure in this story as well.
To know something that we know we don't know, but is important. That is scary.
Well, it's nobody promised you a rose garden, I think, with the Grail legend, and I think I'm not wishing to play that down, because I think actually reading Wolfram von Eschenbach, and his work is available in various translations, accurate ones, less accurate ones. I went for one that was maybe less accurate, but I think highly poetic in this book. Is that the legend of the Grail can still speak to us, and Wolfram's iteration of it, with all of its narrative complexity, its use of humor, its use of play, but also his ability to write the devastating scenes, for example, of Amfortas's suffering, that can connect with us in a way which I think it's as if, I put it this way, reading Wolfram von Eschenbach, the centuries fall away. And it becomes very much a book, not just for our time, but for all times. And I think that is surely what would have attracted Jung to it, because Jung, it seems to me, is embarking on a similar kind of quest, which is to say these things matter in the large, but they also matter to us as individuals as well, in as much as we are related, as he puts it, to something that's infinite. So we're trying to reestablish that connection, and it is, as you say, both fascinating and frightening at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything you'd like to add about this first volume that you feel is key that we haven't touched upon?
I think we've given it a good run through. What I'd like to say to people is Wolfram von Eschenbach, it is just a stupendous work. If by writing this book I can help connect it with Jung, I'd be very pleased. But equally also, if we could then go back and uncover some of the Jungian riches are in there as well, that would delight me as well. What I've tried to do in the book is to make it both have academic probity, but also to be accessible. And if I can open up this wonderful world of Wolfram to people, then I would be very, very pleased. And I think if one goes back and reads Wolfram, well, never disappointed. It's just one of the most incredible works of art in our canon.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a preferred or a recommended translation?
I've used one by Jesse Weston because I think it has a pleasingly antiquated style to it. There's the version in Oxford paperbacks that you talked about. There's also A.T. Hatto's version in Penguin Classics as well. He's been. I would suggest starting either with those because they are very accurate, but you can find the Jessie Weston one on the internet perfectly legitimately for free. And I think her version has a lot to recommend it because she was deeply saturated in this world. If you want a version of Wolfram that's written by a believer, as it were, then the Western translation is a good one to go for. One has to leave some of one's Wagnerian preconceptions at the door because Wagner's Parsifal, itself a stupendous work of art, plays very, very fast and loose with the legend, but it changes it in significant ways that I think won't make Wolfram easier to understand. But certainly Wagner and Wolfram do turn around this idea and thinking those final words of Act 3 and Parsifal, Erlösung dem Erlöser, so redemption to the Redeemer, and this question: what does it mean to be redeemed? What is God? What is it that ails us? What is it that we are suffering from? And how do we heal that suffering? Those questions concern everybody who's related to the world of the brain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is Volume 2 with the press on its way, ready to go?
Volume 2 is on its way. I think its submission date is going to be Christmas this year. I'm working on it as we speak, and certainly Goethe's Faust. Again, I'm looking at it and I'm just amazed by it as a work of art. The complexity of ideas and the power of the communication. And I think in the case of Goethe's Faust and Nietzsche's Zarathustra and Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival, my goodness, Jung had an eye for the texts that really were wesentlich, that really are the essential texts for him as they are for us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I'll be sure to put links for Volume 1, Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival and the Grail of Transformation, in the description below, which is published by Carl Jung Publications, who I should have said at the start were kind enough to send me a review copy. So those links will be in the description below. But other than that, Paul Bishop, once again, it's been a great conversation. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much. And may all of us find on our quest what we're looking for.